You ever play Dr. Muto? It was developed by Midway, and if you're familiar with that name, there's a very high chance it's because of Mortal Kombat. We've all played them, right? Gory arcade classics where you beat the absolute shit out of ninjas, monsters, and literal gods. Well, Midway was also known for making a ton of other games, most limited to the arcade space, with names like Spy Hunter, NBA Jam, and a personal favorite of mine, Rampage. As arcades began to die out in the mid-90s, so too did Midway change their focus, becoming ever more popular on handhelds and home consoles. Sure, many of these games were simple ports and spin-offs, but as time passed, they began experimenting more and more. I remember games like Area 51 and Roadkill, both of which focused on different genres like vehicle combat and first-person shooting. But come 2002, they'd develop and publish their first 3D platformer with Dr. Muto, which poses the age-old question: why clone when you can morph? It starts with Muto asleep on his couch as we're shown a news bulletin detailing his latest scientific endeavor. Turns out he's recently created a machine that can supply planet Midway with endless energy, though his reputation as a crackpot has others rightfully wary. So when his invention ends up destroying the planet, the responsibility of putting it back together falls squarely on the good doctor's shoulders. To do this, he'll have to travel to neighboring worlds and acquire the necessary materials. Chief among these are pieces of Terra, which are essentially the game's power stars, with each one collected after completing some kind of task. There are also loose parts used to construct what Muto calls the Genitor 9000, as well as isotopes that power his computer assistant, Al. Not particularly strong or agile, Muto relies on gadgets to do stuff. He's a pair of boots that allow him to both double jump and hover, along with a spliz gun for taking care of enemies. It has two functions actually, the first being your standard damage blast that's handy for kills, and the second being an electric current, which is good for activating things, along with stopping people dead in their tracks. The control is pretty good. I always get a kick out of Muto's dopey running animation, and the platforming, while having more than a handful of challenging bits, is pretty well done. However, this is far from the extent of his abilities, as making use of the spliz capture, he's able to collect DNA from various fauna. It's with this the Doctor can craft formulas that allow him to morph into different animal types, with each serving a vastly different purpose. The mouse gets you into small areas, the gorilla's able to climb walls and swing around on monkey bars, the spider has the ability to walk on webs and zip from point to point, the guppy lets you swim underwater, and finally, the flying squirrel can fly! But they're only ever used in specific zones with specific objectives, so if you're wondering whether or not you can use them to radically alter the gameplay, the answer is no. I think a big reason for this is that the technology just wasn't there yet. Like, sure, the Banjo games had transformations on the N64, but there was still a limit in place. They also ran on cartridges, meaning the load times were virtually non-existent. Dr. Muto, however, is disc-based, and with the fish in particular, I found myself having to wait for a considerably longer time. And before you ask, no, the disc isn't scratched at all. Speaking of Banjo, the game takes a page out of Tui's book with humongous levels. It's honestly pretty intimidating the first time around, since not only are the areas large, but there are also the aforementioned pieces of Terra, Genitor parts, and isotopes. Thankfully, keeping organized is a cinch. You've a master plan that details the total amounts of every collectible in an area, with vague hints that clue you in on tasks. Along with this is the formula list that tells you what DNA is needed for new morphs, a schematic that details the individual Genitor parts, and finally blueprints that show which scrap pieces craft new gadgets. These are secondary doodads that grant Muto with temporary power-ups like invisibility, the super baller, or rocket boots. Similar to the morphs, the uses here are pretty limited, yet I found myself enjoying their inclusion. Especially the super jump, it straight up turns Muto into Mario, like Yahoo! Still, these are some big-ass levels. Being that there are only 4 planets, it makes sense they'd stretch them out, but I found that it took me multiple hours to complete just one of them, and that was if I got lucky. There are transloaders that teleport you around, but it isn't very straightforward. First off, you have to interact with the things to even use them, and when you finally do, you're met with the realization that before you can go wherever it is you need to go, you have to first return to Muto's lab, where you can then select which transloader you'd like to spawn at. There's also the added annoyance of your health resetting to its default amount every time you do this. Muto can only take 3 hits before dying, but collecting 20 of these heart vials sees it increase a point before capping out at 6 with 1 on reserve. That all goes down the toilet when you fast travel, and if you're worried about somehow forgetting how the health works, don't. Muto reminds you every time. Credit where it's due, each level does a pretty good job standing out from the rest. Toltec is a trash world, Aquium's covered in water, Flodos is the obligatory insta-death sky planet, and Mazon is a subterranean maze-like gauntlet. You can even run around Muto's lab, which acts as a hub area of sorts, complete with its own Terra, isotopes, and Genitor piece, which is hidden in plain sight. And honestly, thank God for the gadgets, because Muto as a 3D platforming hero is the saddest sack I've ever laid eyes upon, going as far as dying if he falls from too high up. To be fair, most 3D platformers have a penalty for falling from too great a height, though it's rarely ever anything as serious as a game over. Conker's the only one I can think of who totally eats it, and that's because the whole point is that he's an anti-platforming hero. But what about here? I hovered and still Muto pancaked. Who knows? Maybe it's the secret sixth morph, one that doesn't call for a formula, but instead a special combination of actions. Simply jump from way up high, hover, and watch as Muto transforms into bird shit. These gorilla sections, on the other hand, can go to hell. There's all this crap being dropped on you, and you're such a huge target that the difference between getting through and dying comes down to sheer dumb luck. On the bright side, you don't have to worry about extra lives, so death is little more than a minor annoyance. And I've felt no greater sense of disorientation in a game than that of these spider sections. Holy shit, they can be really awful. It's these types of boneheaded things that bog it down, and though this may sound harsh, I think if it was developed by anyone else, it'd have fared a lot better. See, with the exception of their certified classics, Midway had a habit of taking various, shortcuts, and Dr. Muto here is no better example. Not only does it ooze a special type of jank, but there's something I've yet to mention. It's impossible to complete. Thanks to a myriad of sloppy design choices, there are a ton of isotopes that are just inaccessible, and Midway themselves knew this. The solution? Make it so only 80% of the total 4,250 were required. Who does that? Why not just remove the isotopes, or better yet, change the programming? Even more embarrassing is, the lead designer was Ed Logg, who'd been in the industry for decades, having developed landmark games like Asteroids, Centipede, and Gauntlet. This would actually be the last game he'd ever work on, inadvertently making it an important piece of gaming history. Way to go, Dr. Muto! And I get it, this game had a less than stellar development cycle thanks to Midway Games West underperforming financially. I suppose I should also mention that Midway Games West wasn't entirely Midway. They were actually Atari, just under a different name. Suddenly it all makes a little more sense, huh? But enough of the negativity, because believe it or not, there's actually quite a bit that I like here, and most of it has to do with the game's humor. It's got that wicked, early 2000s comedy that wants to be super adult, but it knows when to rein it in. It's rated T, so there's nothing too explicit, but with lots of damns, hells, and even the occasional bastard, it's enough to remind you that Dr. Muto isn't cute. It's serious. Dude's got low-res porn on his bedroom walls. He's not like other heroes of the time. At the risk of coming off as a little too heavy-handed, I also think there's a pretty good lesson to be learned. See, while all of these planets kinda suck, they weren't always so bad. It was only after Burn It All came around that Toltec became a trash heap, the waters of Aquium were filled with sludge, and the crust of Flodos was burned out of existence. Make of that what you will, but I get the feeling they're trying to tell us something's wrong here. I'd also be remiss if I didn't at least comment on the music. It's a lot of high-action electronic stuff that complements the overall style nicely. After all, it'd be really weird to run around these desolate planets with cheery tunes playing, so if there's any additional credit to be given, it's that they at least kept the tone consistent. I even recognized a few of the samples they used, like how the lab theme is identical to that of iNinja from iNinja. Dr. Muto came first, but since it's more than likely a shared library type of thing, it doesn't really matter. And even though he's a wimp, playing as Muto and using his various gadgets is an interesting change of pace from other platformers of the time. There were a handful of moments I found myself wishing for more games like this. Can you imagine a solo Dr. Cortex adventure that does all of this but better? I just wish there was more done with the morphs, because outside of their designated zones, you've very little reason to even use them. Except for the squirrel, really, but even then you have to find areas where it isn't locked out. The boss fights fights are the only other spots they prove useful, and it isn't because you can use them for clever strategy. They're straight up required. Vinny's fought with the mouse and gorilla, Carla's underwater, so the fish is the obvious go-to. Steel over here's limited to a turret section, so no battle for the squirrel, and the only way to defeat Bernadal is with the spider. It feels like there was a lot of potential that wasn't realized, but given the circumstances, you can't get too caught up on it. Despite my thinking that this is one of those games you either love or hate, I find that my opinion lands somewhere in the middle. Is it an enjoyable collectathon with lots of originality, good humor, and a distinct style? Yes. But it's also very frustrating at times with concepts that deliver at a bare minimum level. I have to wonder if my love for obscurish 3D platformers is causing this indecisiveness. So what say we shift gears and focus on the Digital Eclipse developed Game Boy Advance port. This released in 2003 and was exclusive to the PAL region, but for the sake of thoroughness, I thought it only appropriate to include. Ditching the 3D angle entirely, this is a traditional side-scroller wherein a massively truncated version of the adventure takes place. It's the same story, with Planet Midway getting blown up and Muto having to save the day, only it's smaller in scale. You can of course morph into a few different animal types, however this too is a bit different. Not only is each transformation unlocked after defeating an area's boss, as well as able to be used pretty much anywhere, but there's also an entirely new one being the horsefly. Filling the role of both bug and flying creature, it stands in for the spider and squirrel respectively. And not only that, I'm almost certain it breaks the later levels. There are all these intricate Gomer puzzles that'd be a real pain in the ass as any of the other forms, yet you can just abuse the flight to get around them. Interestingly, the horsefly was intended to appear in the console game as well. Early E3 reports confirm it being there, and you can even spot it in a few of the cutscenes like the secret ending, which is totally worth unlocking. It's easy to see why it was cut. There were two forms that made it redundant, which is why it makes even more sense to appear here. Not only does it combine those two into one, but it probably saved a ton of space. And I love Digital Eclipse, but they could have saved way more space by just not making this. It isn't horrible, it just isn't fun. The gameplay all but boils down to flipping switches, and in total contrast to the other versions, it's incredibly easy. I thought it was going to be a lot tougher given how close you have to get to damage the enemies, but then I got hit by one and was like, oh, look at that. I guess I'm never gonna die. Then again, if you do somehow die, you've got to start the entire level over, so maybe it's tougher than I think. And that's everything I have to say about Dr. Muto. It isn't the worst 3D platformer ever made, but damn it all if it isn't one of the rougher ones. And it'd be the last developed by Midway, as they'd focus on pushing the 3D Mortal Kombat games, which were just as polarizing. Sure, they'd publish a few genre-adjacent titles, but man, to be the sole 3D platformer made by the guys who brought us Fatalities? It makes you feel all toasty inside.